Shots that sparked a revolution. Lexington and Concord. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 19, 1775, the rolling hills and quiet villages of Massachusetts stood on the brink of history. Tensions between Britain and its American colonies had been simmering for over a decade, fueled by disputes over taxation, representation, and the extent of British authority. What began as political discord was about to explode into open war in the small towns of Lexington and Concord, forever altering the fate of a continent. The seeds of conflict had been sown long before. In 1773, Boston's harbor was stained brown with tea tossed into the sea in protest of British taxation. In response, Parliament imposed harsh measures known as the Coercive or Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts and seeking to tighten Britain's grip. The colonies, however, grew only more defiant, organizing militias and forming networks to share news and coordinate resistance. Among these networks were the Committees of Correspondence, ensuring that any British move would be swiftly reported across the region. By early 1775, General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief and governor of Massachusetts, was increasingly alarmed by the stockpiling of weapons and gunpowder by colonial militias. Intelligence reached him that rebels were gathering arms in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. Gage decided to act discreetly, hoping to avoid a wider confrontation. He planned a swift march to seize the stores before the rebels could react. Late on April 18th, Gage ordered about 700 British regulars, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Marine Major John Pitcairn, to march secretly from Boston toward Concord. Yet secrecy proved impossible in a land alive with watchful eyes. Riders fanned out into the countryside as soon as the troops began to move. Among them were Paul Revere and William Dawes, whose nighttime journeys would become legendary. They carried the warning, "The regulars are coming out." In the early hours of April 19, the militia in Lexington assembled hastily on the village green. Captain John Parker led about 70 colonial militiamen, mostly farmers and townsfolk, uncertain of what lay ahead but determined to show that they would not be cowed. A chill hung in the spring air as the regulars approached through the gloom. Shortly after dawn, the British column entered Lexington. The red-coated soldiers halted as Parker's men stood facing them across the green. No one intended to start a war that morning. The militiamen did not plan to challenge the British militarily, only to demonstrate resolve. The British officers, meanwhile, wanted to push the colonists aside and proceed to Concord. But the weight of fear, tension, and miscommunication hovered over the scene. Suddenly, a shot rang out. History has never clearly established who fired first. Some witnesses claimed a colonist pulled the trigger, others said it came from a British soldier, or perhaps it was an accidental discharge. In an instant, all restraint vanished. The British opened fire in volleys, and some militiamen fired back as they fled. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, and 10 others were wounded. Only one British soldier was injured. The small green in Lexington became the stage for the first bloodshed of the American Revolution. Having scattered the militia, the British pressed on to Concord. Along the road, they encountered pockets of growing colonial resistance. Word of the Lexington clash raced through the countryside, drawing hundreds of militiamen toward Concord from neighboring towns. Around 9 a.m., British forces entered Concord. Their mission was to locate and destroy hidden military stores. They searched homes, shops, and barns, finding only a small quantity of supplies because the colonists had moved most weapons to safer locations in the days prior. Meanwhile, several hundred colonial militiamen gathered on the high ground above the town, forming a force that steadily increased in size. A critical confrontation occurred at Concord's North Bridge. About 400 colonial militiamen advanced toward the bridge to challenge roughly 100 British soldiers guarding it. The British attempted to hold their ground, but the militiamen pressed forward, exchanging shots across the river. This time it was the British who retreated under fire. 2 colonists were killed, but the British suffered several casualties, including officers. The colonial forces reclaimed the bridge, signaling that they were willing and able to stand their ground. After the skirmish at North Bridge, the British realized their situation was becoming increasingly perilous. The number of militiamen surrounding Concord swelled into thousands. Lieutenant Colonel Smith decided to withdraw his troops back toward Boston, beginning what became a harrowing retreat. The return march quickly turned into a running battle. Colonial militiamen, armed with muskets and rifles, poured in from surrounding towns and took positions behind trees, stone walls, and fences along the road. As the British column trudged back toward Boston, it was under constant fire. The colonists used guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly and then melting into the countryside, while the regulars, burdened by their packs and unfamiliar with the terrain, struggled to maintain cohesion. At Merriam's Corner, the colonial forces launched an especially fierce attack, causing significant casualties. As the British fell back through towns like Lincoln and Menotomy, now Arlington, the fighting grew even more intense. Houses and taverns along the road became improvised fortresses for the colonial marksmen. British casualties mounted, and many soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and running low on ammunition. By early afternoon, the British troops reached Lexington again, where they were finally reinforced by fresh regiments led by Brigadier General Hugh Percy. Percy's arrival, with about 1,000 additional men and artillery, prevented the complete collapse of the British force. Nevertheless, even Percy's larger force found itself harassed all the way back to Charlestown. By the time the British reached the safety of Boston's defenses, they had suffered over 270 casualties, including 73 dead and 174 wounded. Colonial losses were roughly 90 killed or wounded. Though small in military scale compared to future battles, the clashes at Lexington and Concord were monumental in their impact. The day's events transformed simmering discontent into outright war. The battles made it clear that the American colonies would not submit quietly to British authority. News spread rapidly throughout the colonies, carried by messengers on horseback and published in newspapers. In London, news of the bloodshed arrived weeks later, shocking Parliament and the King. Within days of the battles, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston, effectively besieging the city and trapping the British forces inside. The siege would last for nearly a year, ultimately forcing the British to evacuate Boston in March 1776. For the colonists, April 19, 1775 became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," immortalized later by poet Ralph Emerson Walden, captured how these local skirmishes resonated far beyond Massachusetts. What began on the village green in Lexington and the bridge in Concord signaled the birth of a revolutionary movement that would reshape not just the 13 colonies, but the entire world. The road from Lexington and Concord led inexorably toward independence. By July 1776, the colonies declared themselves free of British rule. The struggle for that freedom would endure for 8 long years, costing thousands of lives. Yet the battles of April 19, 1775 remain etched in memory as the moment when ordinary farmers and townspeople stood against the might of an empire and chose to fight for liberty. Thus, in the first light of an April morning, amid musket smoke and shouted orders, the American Revolution began, not merely as a political dispute, but as an armed conflict that would forge a new nation. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord reverberated across the Atlantic and into history, sparking a revolution whose echoes would be heard for centuries to come.